Everyone, welcome to another episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast, special campus reform edition here too. Make sure you go to the P.A.S. website, pasreport.com, and visit campusreform.org. I can think of no better guest to have on, given everything that's going on today. I have Professor Alan Dershowitz, author of War Against the Jews. You can find the link over at the PAS report to get your copy of the book. Professor Dershowitz, pleasure to have you on. How are you today?
Well, thank you. I wish it were a better time in the world, but happy to be on during good times and bad times.
Well, you and I both. And just what's your overall thoughts of what we're witnessing on college campuses throughout the country?
We're seeing a cult established. We're seeing a bunch of lemmings. We're seeing parallels to what happened in Nazi Germany in 1933, where everybody came along with the sweep of anti-Semitism. These are not individual students making intelligent decisions. I'll give you an example just from the current news. Part of the claim these students are making is that Israel should engage in a ceasefire. Well, Israel has offered a ceasefire, and Hamas has rejected it. And Secretary of State Blinken has said the only thing that stands between the civilians of Gaza and a ceasefire is Hamas. But do you see a single student criticizing Hamas? These are useful idiots. They have no idea what's going on in the Middle East. They've just gotten swept up in a fury of anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, anti-Americanism. They want to participate in demonstrations. A friend of mine who used to be very hard right, and then became hard left, and I asked him why. He said, the sex is easier. And I mean, that trivializes it a bit, but it's true. And look, I represented objectors, protesters in the late 60s and early 70s. I was probably one of the leading lawyers representing the Chicago Seven, Dr. Spock, the Harvard Law School and university protesters. And I conferred with people like Kathy Boudin. Now, what happened to people like Kathy Boudin? She relatively quickly turned from being a protester into being a terrorist. She ended up murdering 4 people, including 2 policemen and 2 Brinks people. She tried to blow up Fort Dix, an Army base. She blew up a house on 12th Street in which several of her colleagues were killed. The leap between being a cult member, which these kids are, and just like zombies following everything that their leaders, who are their leaders? Their leaders are faculty members. A professor at Columbia the other day, who is a member of Students for Injustice in Palestine, took his students to the tents to teach them about atrocities. I mean, these are not teachers. These are not professors. These are propagandists who are being paid by the federal government indirectly. And so we have to get deeper into this problem. And the major cause of the problem is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and intersectionality, these bogus academic disciplines that are being taught to students, persuading them that the world is divided into 2 groups, the oppressed and the oppressors. And of course, Jews are the oppressors, and Arabs, Muslims are the oppressed. No matter how wealthy and privileged the oppressed are, if they're people of ethnic background, they get called oppressed. No matter how poor a Jew might be, or dark-skinned a Sephardic Jew might be, if you're Jewish, you're an oppressor. So this is a much, much deeper problem. What's going on in Gaza is simply a symptom of a rot that's very deep in academia today.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you said that, because it is a cultural rot that we're seeing, and it is because of academia. I mean, you have school districts in California that talk about how Jews have privilege that came over here in the 1800s when they were poor, they were discriminated against, they were marginalized. And the DEI agenda has really done enormous harm. But what to me is worse than all is the fact that these students don't know anything. I mean, when they talk about human rights, when they talk about women's rights, I mean, Hamas stands against all these things. Let's be honest about it, and yet they're promoting it.
And they know nothing about real oppressed groups. They don't know anything about the Kurds. There are many more Kurds than Palestinians. They have a far stronger claim to statehood than the Palestinians. They've never heard of the Kurds. They've never heard of the Uyghurs in China. They've never heard of other oppressed
Who are going
groups.
through a real genocide right now.
Yeah, it's only about Jews. That's all it's about. Jews, Israel, Zionism. Palestinians are the luckiest people in the world because the Jews are their alleged oppressors. If their oppressors were the Turks, as the oppressors of the Kurds are, if they were the Chinese, they'd get a pass. But if the Jews are the alleged oppressors, they're the luckiest group in the world. The Palestinians deserve a state far less than almost any other group of people. Why? They were offered a state in 1948 by the UN, 1947 as well, even back in 1938. They could have had a two-state solution repeatedly. President Clinton and Ehud Barak had offered it to them. They turned it down. Ehud Olmert offered it to them. They are the least deserving people for statehood, and yet they're the only people who university students and faculty and administrators march. Administrators too, deans of some of the colleges are part of this anti-Semitism, and they're winning. Take, for example, Northwestern University. Northwestern University gave in to the absurd demands of these protesters by saying, all right, we'll admit 5 Palestinian students, whether they're qualified or not, because we now have a quota, at least 5 Palestinians, a floor. We can't have less. We'll have 2 Palestinian faculties. Maybe they never even got an MA or a BA. But if they're Palestinians, we're going to hire them. So what we have at the same time is floors for Palestinians now and ceilings for Jews. Look what happened at Harvard. 23% of Harvard students on the merits, based on meritocracy, were Jews when I taught there for 50 years. 23%. Now it's 9%. Have the Jewish students got any less qualified? No, they have quotas. And it's a worse quota than happened in the 20s. In the 20s, the racist president of Harvard, A. Lawrence Lowell, introduced a quota of 10%, and people objected to it. Now it's 9%, and nobody's objecting to it because the ultimate goal is the end of meritocracy. It's the substitution of identity politics. You get admitted to Ivy League schools in proportion to your proportions of the population. So Jews are 1.8%, they'll get 1.8% of the slots. African Americans are 13, 14%, they'll get 13, 14% of the slots. That's what they did in Russia during the Tsarist period with the numerus clausus. And Jews made it very successfully if you didn't have to be picked. If you did it on your own, if you were a musician, a chess player, an entrepreneur, you could make it. But if you had to be picked by someone else, I have a prediction. Jews are no longer going to get Nobel Prizes. And it won't be because they're less qualified. It's because the Nobel Committee will stop picking them. And so let's stop bragging about how many Nobel Prizes we had, because the Nobel Prize will no longer be on the merits. It's never been on the merits when it came to literature and some of the other subjective factors. But you'd think it would be on the merits for physics. Albert Einstein wouldn't get one today.
Well, it's disgraceful. Meritocracy is what has propelled our society to success throughout our history. It's what has led the United States to become the most powerful and best country in the entire world. Yet now we see you're actually punished. If you put in the hard work, if you actually have achievements, you're punished. And what does it say about the future of our society where an entire generation is indoctrinated to despise the country they come from, chant death to America, chant long live Hamas? Did you ever think you would see the day that this would be take place?
No, and of course, the reason so many of these people are students today is because we've done away with meritocracy. We've done away with admission standards. We've done away with grades. We've done away with the law school aptitude test, with other tests. And so all these idiots get admitted just because of their ethnicity or their race or their gender, and then they become gender warriors or ethnic warriors or race warriors. And, they major in absurd subjects. The other thing that I rail against is these ethnic studies departments. There should not be a Black studies department. There should not be a gay studies department. There should not be a Southeast Asian studies department. There should be history and science and mathematics. These departments have become not only cheering centers for a particular race or ethnicity, but a zero-sum game. If you're in one ethnic studies department, you're going to hate the people from other areas, and that's what's happened. If you look at the petitions, look at the petitions that came out after October 7th, the worst massacre in modern Jewish history since the Holocaust. If you look at the petitions, they came from all of these ethnic studies departments. They came from the DEI bureaucracy. These are the breeding ground of bigotry and anti-Semitism, and they have to end. And not a single university president has the guts to do it. Let me tell you about Harvard Law School. I taught there for 50 years. I was certainly one of the most popular professors. Students just stood in line to get into my classes. Today, I have not heard a single Harvard Law School professor. There's about 100 of them, probably close to half are Jewish. I haven't heard a single Harvard professor have the courage to stand up against this bigotry, against this anti-Semitism, and in favor of students. I wish I was still there. I retired some years ago. I'm 85 years old. If I were 25, I'd be in Gaza today fighting for the IDF, but I'm 85, so I can only fight with my pen and my brain and being on fine podcasts like this one. But where are the professors? And I guarantee you that many of the professors at Harvard Law School are on the side of the Jewish kids. They just don't have the courage to stand up for it and say anything in public.
Why is that?
People, it's the Joe Biden approach. Don't alienate anybody. When you talk about anti-Semitism, make sure you throw in Islamophobia, discrimination against Arabs, discrimination against Muslims, discrimination against Palestinian Americans. My favorite part of that statement that he made the other day is he singled out Palestinian Americans. There is no discrimination against them, but he didn't mention Israeli Americans. And there's massive discrimination against them. I have a friend who's an Israeli American, and he's about to get an honorary degree at Columbia University. And there are protests just because he's Jewish and Israeli. President Biden, why do you do that? Why do you have to pander to Michigan? Why do you have to advocate the two-state solution, namely Michigan and Wisconsin, or Michigan and Minnesota? That's your two-state solution. And I'm not going to vote for a candidate who panders like that. And I think a lot of pro-Israel voters, whether they be Jewish or Christian, are not going to vote for a candidate who cannot unequivocally denounce anti-Semitism without talking about Palestinian American rights. There's no problem with Palestinian Americans in universities today. They are adored, they're loved, they get sex all they want because they are the heroes on the campus. Don't waste your time and energy talking about Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans. If there is discrimination, talk about it then. You know, it would be as if there were a series of lynchings in the South and a bunch of blacks were lynched. And the president gets on television and says, well, I want to condemn lynching, but I also want to condemn the victims of people who are discriminating against white people in admission to university. It's not the time. It's not the place. To everything there is a season, said Ecclesiastes. And President Biden has no sense of the room, no sense of the season, no sense of the time. This is the time for unequivocal, singular condemnation of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish attitudes. That's the problem we're facing today on American universities, nothing else.
Yeah, and we see the lack of leadership, and I don't think people understand the anti-Semitism at places like Columbia University. That dates all the way back to the 1930s and 40s, where they wouldn't let Jews on the main campus. They relegated them to Brooklyn, New York instead, a satellite campus that they had. It really is amazing. But how do we fix the problem of today? How do we get rid of this rot that has infected academia and is an embarrassment to me in my profession, you as a professor, as well as other professors out there? I mean, we're destroying ourselves through self-inflicted wounds in higher education. How do we begin to turn it around?
First, we stop federal funding of any university that doesn't combat anti-Semitism. That's the first thing we do.
And these are Title VI violations. So I want people to know that, like, this could happen tomorrow. We don't need any new laws. It could stop tomorrow if the Department of Education actually enforced Title VI.
That's right. And the former Secretary of Education said she would if she were the Secretary of Education. And then we have to cut off funding. I will no longer send a nickel to Yale, where I went to law school, to Harvard, where I taught, to Brooklyn College, where I did my undergraduate work. I'm a poor, retired professor, but I have friends who are billionaires, and they're not sending the money. They're not sending, and they're going to start defunding universities, because why would you spend your hard-earned money to teach these ethnically specific cheerleading hateful courses. It makes no sense at all. And American universities are going to fall to the bottom of the rankings if this continues.
Well, and I think we're witnessing that worldwide. For the last 5 years in a row, the universities have fallen in the rankings. We used to be, many of them used to be in the top 200. Now they're out, and you have a lot of Chinese universities taking their place. And so, what does this say about the future of the United States if we continue on this trajectory?
Well, first, let me tell you that the rankings are not neutral either. You're going to get universities getting better rankings if they make their students happy by giving in to some of these absurd demands. So, the evaluations aren't perfect, but everybody who knows academia, I've been in academia 70 years. I started in 1955. All right, it's
Wow.
69 years ago. I started. I know a bit about academia. I was the president of the student government at Brooklyn College. I was the editor in chief of the Yale Law Journal. I was the youngest professor at Harvard Law School. I know something about academia, and it is on a terrible decline, not only in terms of courage, but in terms of academic ability. Today, we are not rewarding meritocracy. We are rewarding how you were born. It's the opposite of Martin Luther King's dream. I have a dream that someday my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Today, they're judged by the color of their skin, not the content of their character, and not the meritocracy, and not the hard work. There are exceptions, but too few.
Well, I could give you a whole bunch of papers to read from my students, and you see the writing abilities have just completely collapsed. Students aren't reading anymore. And it seems that they go through more schooling than any previous generation, yet they come out knowing less and also being less capable to
I,
perform in the workplace and everything. So, aren't we failing the students? Aren't the students set up for failure at this point?
No, they may not be, because they will be judged by the same criteria that they're being judged in college. They'll be hired by Goldman Sachs. They'll be hired by the big law firms based on their race. And what I want is, I want every single one of these cult members, these students, these haters, these Hitler Youth, to be identified. And I want to hold the law firms responsible for hiring them if they do. Do you really think your clients want to be represented by somebody who supports the rape of women on October 7th? There are people like that. The National Lawyers Guild supports rape. The National Lawyers Guild, by any means necessary. National Lawyers Guild's second largest bar association in America. I wouldn't dream of hiring somebody from the National Lawyers Guild to do anything. And I would hope that employers, if they choose, they can refuse to hire these people. And if they don't choose, we should put pressure on them to refuse to hire these people. Otherwise, they'll become our future leaders. 10 years from now, they'll be in Congress. This thug, this
Just to
anti-Semite.
interrupt you for 1 second. How can any nation survive when the generation that's supposed to be in charge despises it?
Well, no, of course that's true. And there's the student at Columbia who was caught on videotape saying he hopes Zionists die. Zionists don't deserve to live. You know what his last sentence was? My goal is to become a member of Congress, to become a member of the squad. Look, Bowman is in the squad. His hero is Norman Finkelstein, who praised October 7th and said it was a wonderful thing. It warmed every element of his heart to see these women being raped and murdered and beheaded. That's Norman Finkelstein. And then you got Bowman, a congressman from Brooklyn, of all places where I come from, praising Norman Finkelstein. That's like praising Adolf Hitler. That's like praising Stalin or Pol Pot. And you're a member of Congress, and there'll be other members of Congress like you. The squad is despicable, and they're moving people away from voting for Democrats. And certainly I am no longer presumptively a Democrat. I'll vote for the best candidate, and most of them will probably be Democrats. But I no longer consider myself as presumptively a Democrat because of the squad, and because of Nancy Pelosi, who's getting a Medal of Freedom today. Nancy Pelosi put her arm around one of the worst members of the squad, and we're seeing that Nancy Pelosi is making all kinds of terribly anti-Israel statements now that she's left the House of Representatives. And so if she's the Democratic Party, I'm not the Democratic Party.
Yeah, we certainly need standards in a society. This is what happens when you remove all standards within a society and just let everyone do what they want on the basis of the color of their skin or what ethnicity they subscribe to. It's disgraceful. Everyone needs to check out War Against the Jews. Links will be up at the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com. Also visit campusreform.org. Professor Dershowitz, pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise, I wish it were about a more pleasant subject, but thanks for having me.